Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Brig Daniels. I am a visiting professor of law here at the University of Utah. I would like to welcome everyone here that's in person and the many people who are online on behalf of the Wallace Stegner Center and the University of Utah S.J. Quinney College of Law and the Tanner Humanities Center at the University of Utah College of Humanities. As we normally begin these things, we begin with an acknowledgement, and we acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between the many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between the tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm that the University of Utah's commitment to that partnership with the Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. Before we begin, I'd just like to note that there is going to be a screening tomorrow, Wednesday, April 12th, noon to 2, Stuart Udall, The Politics of Beauty. It's a film screening with the filmmaker, with questions and answers with the filmmaker, John DeGraff. We are delighted today to join with the Tanner Humanities Center to sponsor this Greenbag Lecture Series on corresponding with the young Wallace Stegner with Anne E. Palmer. Just a brief introduction of Dr. Palmer. She is an author of Years of Promise, the University of Utah's A. Ray Olpin Years, 1946 to 1964, and founding director of the University of Utah Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. At Stanford University, she directs the Aspen Rising Presidential Fellowship in the Graduate School of Education and conducts academic and oral histories. She holds a Master's of Public Administration from this university, University of Utah, and a Doctorate of Education from the University College London. Her doctoral thesis on academic foundations of the United States Peace Corps was written at the University of Utah's American West Center. Dr. Palmer was a member of the organizing committee and creation of the Wallace Stegner Center for Land and Resources and the Environment, collaborating with Professor Emeriti Bonnie Mitchell. With that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Palmer. Thank you for being here, Doctor.
Well, it's wonderful to be here with you, and I'm so pleased that we have had a chance to have this Greenbag session right between the grand snowstorms and before the sandbagging, and it's just so lovely to be here in this beautiful S.J. Quinney Law School building. So thank you for joining me today. I wanted to begin by telling you a little bit of the story of how I came to inherit letters by Wallace Stegner that I've brought with me to the University of Utah and that I plan to be contributing to the Marriott Library Special Collections. So Wallace Stegner's prose has really inspired generations of Americans to seek their own truth, and this is one of the quotes that urges us to do so. And this is one of the duties of a historian, is to seek the truth. We're here today also to celebrate the fact that we do have a collection of Wallace Stegner literary manuscripts, photographs, correspondence at the University of Utah, and to also honor his will for that collection being part of this university. So I'd love to tell you a little bit more about how I got familiar with it and how I might encourage others to explore it as well. So the seeds of this presentation really began when I was with the Continuum magazine, the magazine of the University of Utah. And as Brig mentioned, was part of the organizing committee that was establishing the Wallace Stegner Center for Land Resources and the Environment here. One of the exciting jobs that I got was to call Robert Redford and to ask him if he would please come to the first symposium. And as Bob Kiter reminded me a little while ago, he said he could be here if the media was going to be there. And so we had a long pause, and I think I had to call some of my friends at the Tribune to say, "Are you coming up here to Research Park?" And all in all, it was a great success. So that was, I believe, 28 years ago at the Stegner Symposium, and many of you may have attended also the wonderful symposium on the Great Salt Lake that took place in March. So that was a reason that I got involved with this, but growing up, I knew that we had a family connection to Wallace Stegner because in our home there was a pewter teapot of a koi fish. And my mother had told me that that teapot had been given to her parents on their wedding. So Dorothy Irvine and Oscar Wood Moyle were married July 8th, 1931. And the Irvine name in the Irvine legacy and friendship with Wallace Stegner is the one that I primarily explore with you today. So that was my first interest, was why did we have this teapot in our house? Why did Wallace Stegner give this wedding gift to my grandparents? And then, like him, I worked at the University of Utah and then went to Stanford. So I've really had a long-standing interest in the Dean of Western Literature, the great writer Wallace Stegner, for a number of years. So here we have cousin Robert Irvine, and he had told me that he had a letter from Wallace Stegner that he was going to give to me. He lives in Carmel, and I was going there for the State Economic Summit in 2021, and he said, "Please come by my house. I have a letter for you." Actually, there are two letters, but I put one of them in a book, and I can't remember which book it's in. So I showed up, and it was prime COVID time, so we had to meet outdoors in his patio garden. And he shows up with this, not a letter, but a whole scrapbook of letters, in fact, 41 letters that were written from Wallace Stegner to his father, Garner Irvine. And I thought, heck, these really will make a good addition to the archive. So receiving these 41 letters, I then was able to review and explore this 60-year friendship that began because Garner Irvine, who's also known as Jack Irvine and is also known as John Irvine, had taught the rudiments of racket sports to Wallace Stegner at the Salt Lake Tennis Club. So before I give these letters to the university, I really wanted to uncover more of the meaning and who the people in the letters are and what was going on, especially at the University of Utah. I am a historian of the U of U, and I am very interested in how this wonderful university developed and influenced the students who are present. And if there are students here, I hope that I will also be able to influence you to explore the archives yourselves, to make connections of your own between your family stories, between the environment and this institution, and to see the genesis of a person who was rather immature in his growing up years at the University of Utah, and as we know, became the Dean of Western Writers. We know from his essay, At Home in the Fields of the Lord, he eventually realized that if he were to have a hometown, Salt Lake City would be Wallace Stegner's town. He came from a family that was very migrant. They moved here from Kansas. He lived in Iowa City, Saskatchewan. And when they came to Salt Lake City, the Stegner family of George, Hilda, Cecil, his older brother, and Wally, their father was always on a get-rich-quick kind of scam, and he was a bootlegger during Prohibition, serving alcohol in the parlor of their home, making the family really sequestered away from the ongoings and the dealings of alcohol that were happening during that time. It was very embarrassing for Stegner to have to be with his mother away from the rest of the home during the comings and goings of clients who would bring friends and dates and cheating on their wives and all kinds of unsavory things. So, as you know, he also set 3 novels here. They were The Big Rock Candy Mountain, Recapitulation, and The Preacher and the Slave. So the possibilities of discovering connection and purpose in these archives really came home to me, in part because I was spending time in the archives looking at the Everett Cooley Oral History Collection, as well as the manuscripts and the university archives during the A. Ray Olpin years. I have to impress on you the power of exploring your past to make peace with your present and discover future possibilities. This is one of the things that really draws me to history and American history in particular. So I want to plant some seeds of my own for prospective archival researchers wandering into special collections. And this brings me to how did this green bag come about? And my friend Nedra Chandler from the Wallace Stegner Center EDR program had not been to see this wonderful Stegner collection until right after I received these letters in November 2021. So we went to the archives, and I wanted her to be able to see the logic and the connection between resources, the environment, and the land, and also to emphasize the importance of the humanities part of this wonderful center. So let's see what these letters I inherited from my ancestors might signal about the hopes Wallace Stegner had for building a purposeful future. As I mentioned, Wally came here when he was 12 years old with his family from Great Falls, Montana. He was scrawny, he was not athletic. He was acutely aware, in his words, of being a Gentile in the New Jerusalem, a non-Mormon boy with a desperate desire to fit in, to belong. He joins the Boy Scouts. He ascends to becoming an Eagle Scout rather quickly. And as you can see from his East High yearbook, he was also into sports, writing. He was a lieutenant in Company D of the Reserved Officers Training Corps, the ROTC. And then in the summary of this letter collection, my cousin Robert Irvine wrote to me, quote, "My father and Wallace Stegner were lifelong best friends. As you know, Stegner had a troubled family life, and that was why my father and his father and mother, Robert R. Irvine, one of the original surveyors of the Transcontinental Railroad, and Dora Davis Irvine, made it possible for Stegner to live with them through East High School and the University of Utah." Now, this is a little-known fact, which is that he was indeed living part of the time, not with his own family who did live here, but with our relatives, the Irvines. So Robert said that Stegner and Irvine had side-by-side bedrooms in the basement of their grandfather's house, which was just over here at 1008 South, 13th East. So they had a short walk to school, and I've had a few friends who've been able to tell me that their grandparents also accompanied Stegner and Garner Irvine on their walks to school as well. Kind of a funny story. The house originally had an old-fashioned coal furnace that had to be hand-stoked each morning, and each morning during the wintertime, Robert said that his father would pound his walking stick on the floor above his father's bedroom, signaling that it was time to get up and stoke the coal. Well, an interesting thing happened with the coal furnace, and that is While the parents were away, Wallace and Garner sold the furnace. And this was the first antique that was sold by Garner Irvine, who would go on to be the purveyor of the Irvine and Miller Antique Store and Era Antiques. So what happened after the furnace was sold was the grandparents came home from a vacation to California and laughed it off and bought a new furnace. So Stegner also, now at about age 13, was loving his studies at East High School, very intent on impressing his teachers. He was extremely bookish, spent a lot of time in libraries, and was extremely fond of the classics. He was in the Latin club for 4 years, taking 6 Latin classes in high school. And he had such a burning desire to impress his teachers at East High School that, as you know, if you've read Recapitulation, he goes to the clay at Red Butte Creek, brings it home, and builds a Roman fort or castra to impress the teachers. I think probably his classmates knew him as a really big nerd, but he didn't care. Another photograph here showing that he was a member of the business staff at the East High School. Then, as we see in these letters that I've inherited, describing numerous hijinks that ensued after Stegner skips 7th and 10th grades. So he's a little guy, he's a smart guy, and he skips 2 grades in high school. He graduates at age 16. Fortunately for Stegner, he grows 6 inches between his senior year of high school and when he starts at the University of Utah and begins to mature. And he's always working out, running and lifting weights and trying to build muscle, trying very hard to fit in the Gentile with the Gentile background that he has. And then Wally goes on to use these budding tennis skills to join the tennis team and working at becoming at the University of Utah really a big man on campus. So this is what the University of Utah looked like when he entered the University of Utah in 1926. George Thomas was the president, and the university was primarily centered around President's Circle. This is where where Wally grew in stature, and he becomes a tremendous flirt, very, very girl crazy. And he and Garner are writing letters back and forth, and in fact, they share a particular girlfriend named Alta. On October 22nd, 1927, he writes to his pal, "Dear John, your letter was a pleasant surprise as I thought you had jumped in the toilet and jerked the string. You should talk about benders you were on." And then he goes on talking about this booze bender, and he's about 18 now. "Last Tuesday, we had 2 bottles of beer apiece before we got started. Then we killed a whole quart of gin at Frank's and afterwards drank 4 more bottles of beer. We were slightly out of focus, you think? After driving madly up and down Wasatch Boulevard, we careened down Apricot Street, climbed back up Capitol Hill, and upon Bai's suggestion, drove down the Capitol steps. About 45 minutes later, I came to down on 8th West and 5th South while Bai was fixing a flat tire. Neither of us knew how in hell we got there. Both Eddie and I got sick and heaved all over, and all in all, it was a hell of a hot time. I left all my tools down there. We changed the tire and had to get some new ones yesterday. All this transpired because my folks were deer hunting down in the Kaibab. They won't be back for a couple days yet. Last night, I went out and mugged Dolly for 4 hours straight. I take it the mugging is kind of making out. He goes on to explain that tomorrow he will take Jack's former girlfriend, Alta, to the homecoming dance after the football game against Colorado University. All the boys are up on the hill tonight, but an abscess tooth removal causes Wally to stay in. Here we have the young collegian on the Kaibab Plateau. The Stegner family had access to a fishing cabin at Fish Lake and spent a great deal of time in the wilderness, exploring, camping, relaxing away from the business of running the booze gin in Salt Lake City. He's carrying perhaps some water to make some coffee and sober up. It was around this time that the furnace sale took place, a feat that would undoubtedly have been easier with KSL.com, but they did their best to earn money where they could. And in many of these letters, Stegner talks about how he is broke and lonely and in need of work. According to cousin Robert, Stegner and Jack, or Garner Irvine, quote, often raided my grandfather's liquor cabinet, so much so that grandfather took to marking his bottles after each use. According to my father, he and Wally got around that by adding water to the level of the mark after they had a few drinks, bringing the level up. After a while, his father, noting the diluted mixture, made the comment that he'd never realized whiskey could evaporate. Other hijinks at the University of Utah were balanced with his writing activities on the Daily Utah Chronicle. Again, the twin fascinations of many a University of Utah man in the 1920s, 30s, and on, fraternity life and co-eds. He was sharpening his skill in journalism and letter writing to Jack, who at this point had been sort of banished by his parents. Garner goes to Washington he transfers to go to school at George Washington University because his parents didn't want him to be spending so much time with what they considered an unsuitable girl. That was Alta. Quote, save a little affection for Alta, my boy, for she loves you dearly. Maybe when you get back, we can take one last pilgrimage to the blossom-scented lanes of Riverton, scene of our youthful hopes and affections, the sweet caresses of a Titian-haired maid, and as we walk up the shaded path, we might shed a tear for the days that are no more. While he's practicing a little bit of melodrama in the letters that he's sending to his friend, and also making him a little bit jealous with spending so much time with maybe a platonic dating of his girlfriend, Alta. There are other tales of fraternity initiation in the letters, which Wallace Stegner calls goathead. And to me, one of the most valuable items in the collection that I inherited, which will be coming to the University of Utah, is a constitution which Stegner co-wrote to form a men's athletic and social club. And this has only been referenced up until now in the Utonium yearbooks, but we have now the entire Constitution. So meet the founding fathers of the Tillicums Club. This is the organization that they founded. The members become lifelong correspondents and stay in very close contact with one another. The purpose of the organization is both to be an athletic club and a social organization, a new kind of social club on campus. One of the interesting things to me about the Constitution that I have is that it came in a blue envelope from the Salt Lake Tribune. So I was wondering, why was someone from the Salt Lake Tribune sharing the preamble, the Constitution of the Tillicums back, and with the help of the Tribune's Anna Daraban, found that one of the friends of Wallace Stegner, Lyndon Crone, who was a member of the Tillicums, also became a sports reporter at the Tribune covering tennis. So these themes of athletics and social organizations continue to develop over their lifetime. But we know sort of who created the Tillicums Club, but not necessarily why. And one theory is that Stegner actually was blackballed by the fraternity that he wanted to join, which was the Beta Theta Pi fraternity. And he joins the Sigma News, but he also wanted to create this competing organization in which they compete in athletics against the traditional Greek letter fraternities. So again, Wally is this young man who is trying so hard to fit in, to create camaraderie, to build friendships, because he comes from a very, very broken and migrant past. The preamble of the organization, the Tillicums Club, does say the purpose is creating and perpetuating good fellowship, promoting athletics to the best of our ability, and securing such wholesome recreation as may be obtained by our social activities. Article 1 states that the Tillicum is a Siwash Indian word meaning friend. We do not know why or condone the borrowing of indigenous terms describing First Nations peoples. This group in particular that they have named comes from the Pacific Northwest. But during this period in time, there is a sense of reverence and honor for tribal affiliations. And again, Stegner is all about emphasizing this sense of belonging. We know also from the letters that Stegner tried to pay the dues of one of the club members who threatened to quit. And the friend says, "I won't belong to a club whose aim is friendship and then not like some of the members. Nothing doing. I'm through." His friend would not accept his gift of the payment of his dues. Here we have the fraternity that he did join, the literary fraternity, which is an important national organization, and it foreshadows his later success as a writer. This was in 1929. Again, Stegner is plumbing the themes of youth and identity, age and faith throughout his career, and thinking about these formative years at the university and what they meant to him. It hasn't got anything to do with chronological age. It's times of hope and happiness. I was able to find in the university archives Wally's grade records and his transcripts, and you can see from this that during the time that he was at the university, Stegner moved twice. He spent 2 years as a junior, in fact, dropped out for half a year to earn money because he was broke. And he also graduates with honors, and his only C's were in English and philosophy. He was a pretty good student for a guy who was having so much fun at the U. The literary magazine at the University of Utah that he edited was called The Pen. And again, we see this trajectory of his intellectual and imaginative efforts. This is the time when he wins his first prize for writing, the short story contest in the Salt Lake Telegram newspaper. The honor of winning it meant that his piece was published, and the title of it was Reciprocation. From the letter collection, I can see the pride he took in having edited the pen, because he carries this stationery with him even after he leaves the University of Utah and writes letters back to home from Iowa on the pen stationery. Pretty neat. Here we have the famous tennis team that he was a part of for several years. And for his activities in tennis, he spends a lot of time writing to and kind of sparring with his friends, Gardner Irvine and others, talking about tennis. After he leaves the University of Utah and he is working on his graduate degree in Iowa, he says, he writes, quote, "Played tennis at the field house, and can you believe it, the courts were gravel. Having nothing else to do, I take my pen in hand to answer your last letter before I get it. I have to be hitting the snore slab in 10 minutes, as I have to get up at 6 a.m., an unearthly hour, in truth, to play old Stan pool. We started at 6 tonight, and he cleaned me the first set. However, I got my powerful service and smashing net game going, and quickly ran out the second set, 6-2. I assumed a 4-2 lead in the third set, at which point Stan decided he couldn't see anymore. So we had to call it a night, and we'll play again tomorrow. If I clean him, I have to play Sterling Bailey in the semifinals and give him 15 each game. This handicap tourney is the dough. It sure makes a guy feel big to clean some big lug. The August 31st, 1927 letter goes on with regards to Irvine's mother and father, my great-grandparents, and closes with some free verse about cigarettes and co-eds. Quote, camels are brown, old golds are not. Took Edie out Thursday and was she hot? Woo-ee! Your friend, Wally. Quote, as my tennis and basketball playing friends ushered me into the human world and taught me how to belong, this handful of friends introduced me to the life of the mind where, even though I didn't know it then, I most wanted to live. No university, even the greatest, could have done much more. Here we have the tennis doubles partners, Irvine and Stegner. They were formidable, and they were the closest of friends. Stegner had arrived in Salt Lake City having no felt sense of a personal past, and he develops one here. He writes in recapitulation that friendships had a substantial hand in shaping him, and that his friend Jack, who in the book he renames Bruce Hansen, quote, all but created him. And that comes from living at Jack's house and living with Jack's family. He begins to assume an identity that embodies the life that he experiences in Salt Lake City. For 2 or 3 years, he says, the Irvine home had been more a home for him than his own. So this is the I&M Rug and Linoleum Company. It was the family business. It was the Irvine and Miller business. They specialized in linoleum and rugs for hotel and apartment furnishings, and it's where Wallace Stegner gets his job working for 25 cents an hour for the first year, and then 3 years later is moved up to a salary of 40 cents an hour. It was at 251 South State Street, and it's extraordinary the number of capers that a few young men can get into when they're delivering rugs, sleeping on piles of rugs, and what they called time to hang a few shades. That meant, it refers to the drapery department, but it was their code word for having a few beers at the nearby Zhang Cafe, which is about a half a block away from the I&M store. While Irvine was away, Stegner uses the I&M stationery to describe the Tillicum's fall rushing activities, saying, quote, we are going to assess the boys for the brawl, and spent $143 on a stag banquet at the Manor House. After he moves to Iowa, he writes back to Garner asking him to buy a very ornate cedar chest for my girl, whom we know is Juanita Crawford. He says he'll pick it up. He says his folks will come and pick up the chest of drawers sometime before Christmas. So Stegner's in Iowa getting his graduate degree. His girl's still in Salt Lake City, and he's writing to his friend Garner saying, would you mind getting me a lovely ornate chest of drawers? And he describes it as, I want the one with the brass buttons on it. And Wally writes, quote, I am a solitary, lonesome figure myself as I plod wearily to work every morning with the bitter wind whistling around my bony knees and my ragged coat pulled tightly under my chin in a futile attempt to keep out the hard, icy particles of sleet. I miss Autumn Leaf and her itinerant driver, but I must not complain. Assuage my grief. He was broke, he was lonely, and he was writing about it constantly. That was his MO. According to Robert Steensma's wonderful 2000 book, Wallace Stegner, Salt Lake City, which was published by the University of Utah Press, we know that Stegner also maintained long friendships with English professors at the University of Utah and would contact them when he returned to Salt Lake City as a celebrated author and a creative writing teacher. He maintained a genuine appreciation for the education he received here in what we would call today being a first-generation low-income student. He had no experience from his parents of a college education and all that it entailed. Quote, "The high school I attended gave me a better training in fundamentals than I see my grandchildren getting now in much more sophisticated places. And if the University of Utah, when I went there, was a streetcar college of 3,000 or 4,000 students, it was also, like everything else in Salt Lake City, safe, friendly, comfortable, and even then, it was plugged into at least some of the circuits of world mind." So coming from an unstable home, struggling with his self-image and finding his way to intellectual maturity at the university, Stegner was ready to move on to one of the most distinguished American literary careers of the 20th century. In 1931, Stegner visited his migrant parents who are now living in Reno, Nevada. His father, George, is part owner of a gambling casino, and in one of the letters I have, he writes to Garner and says, "I need you to send me some Shine-All floor cleaner." And then he says about Reno. Reno is bustling at 2 o'clock in the morning. The cops kept a tight lid on the town. He was going to watch the heavyweight Max Bay fight. He asked Jack Irvine to send some, as I said, the floor cleaning material. In one of Ollie's letters to Jack, he writes, "Never think Reno isn't a hot town. At 2 bells in the morning, you can't find a parking place anywhere, and yet the place is as orderly as any town I was ever in. They soak a drunken driver 150 days in jail or $300 fine, and the rest of the disturbances get misdemeanors in proportion, so nobody disturbs the peace much." Stegner would complete his work for his master's degree the following January. But while he's in Iowa, he's constantly crossing the country either by rail or by train to Salt Lake City to see friends or to see his friends in Reno, Nevada. As a graduate teaching assistant at the University of Iowa, he receives his master's degree in 1932 and continues on for the PhD in creative writing in 1935. Again, he's still clinging to this college, Utah Penn Stationery, writing to Irvine about the horrors of the gravel tennis courts, and says, even worse, quote, "My students don't like me. I forget my lines the first day, and one of the buggers giggled. So I got mad and soaked it to them. The madder they get, the heavier I lay on the work. I've got the pot lickers by the knockers, and is what I mean. I'll learn 'em not to snicker. Write to me because I get lonesome for the I&M. Yours devoted, Steg." The tone of his letters often really implies this sense that he was misused by the world. The students don't respect him, just as the students at East High didn't respect him. This longing, of course, would diminish after he meets his future wife, Mary Stuart Page. And Mary was working at the library at the Augustana University in Iowa, where he was working as a teaching assistant while getting his PhD at the University of Iowa. Throughout his life, of course, Mary was the most balancing force, a wonderful editorial assistant, and the best supporter a formerly wild young man could ask for. So they were married in 1934, Wally and Mary, and they moved to the University of Utah to Salt Lake City, where Wally teaches for 3 years. 3 years later, their son Paige was born in 1937. And from the scrapbook, I have numerous letters and Christmas cards from the family of Wally, Mary, and Paige Stegner. And these two provide a glimpse into this maturing friendship between the Irvines and the Stegners. I love this picture, which we have thought, which came from the Stegner collection, we think might have been around Zion National Park. After he leaves the University of Utah in 1937, Stegner continues drawing on friendships forged at the U to develop source material for his books and articles and essays. Even 40 years later, he writes to Garner Irvine, who has a news store called the Era Antiques, and says, quote, "Paige and I are writing a long piece on the 5 Rocky Mountain states for Atlantic Monthly, and I need you to send me a phone book so that I can contact sources. I've got a date with the mayor, and I've written for dates with the governor, the chair of the board of SCAGs, a guy at Zion Securities, some newspaper people, some university people, and some more. Where I'm short is in the high power area, especially the Mormon church and the financial ruling class. The Mormon hierarchy may choose not to talk to me, but I hope I can find some financiers, if only old Orville Adams, who will. It occurs to me that Dill Nebaker might be able to give me some steers and some introductions, but I don't have his address. What Stegner wants is for Garner to mail him the Salt Lake City directory so he can look up the sources that he needs for the article that he and Paige are writing together on the 4 Rocky Mountain states. I highly commend this article as well. It's a terrific summary of the development of the arts, recreation, and education in the Rocky Mountain area. So from Stegner's University of Utah faculty file, which was held here by the president's office, I was able to learn more about what he did as an instructor. And as he writes about some of his other activities while teaching at the U, he was involved in publicity writing for the University of Utah. He was a book page reviewer for the Salt Lake Tribune. And during this period, he also publishes the short story titled Home to Utah, which is it's a very biographical story about a nonstop road trip he took from the Midwest to St. George to see a college sweetheart whom Stegner knows has already fallen out of love with him. Extremely bittersweet. And this young lady would be, of course, Juanita Crawford. After teaching at Utah, Stegner goes on to teach at the University of Wisconsin and Harvard University before he settles at Stanford University, where he founds the creative writing program. Now, most people know him for receiving the Pulitzer Prize in Fiction for Angle of Repose, which this shows the first edition artwork for the cover of that book. For this book, he decides to write about a wheelchair-bound historian who is writing about his frontier-era grandparents. He wins this Pulitzer in 1972. And if you've kept up with what's happened in the New Yorker of the last year and other publications, there's really been a slow burning scandal over his lack of recognition of the literary sources of the material that he uses to write Angle of Repose. It came really from the unpublished archival letters, primary sources of a woman named Mary Halleck Foote. So there have been accusations of some plagiarism as other writers in the room know, borrowing is not uncommon for writers in order to instill their ideas. So because of this scandal, I'm now in this long queue of researchers who are trying to see what are in the Stanford archives about Stegner, trying to get access to his paper. He has a small paper collection there from 1961 to 1965. And from that, I was able to find extremely meticulous research on the history of Mormonism, which he conducted for the Gathering of Zion, as well as his advocating that the Green Library at Stanford invest more in Western Mormon Americana history. And he's saying not only I will be interested in this material, but other students will as well. And he's writing to the historian for the LDS Church, asking for access to original journals as well. And they get into quite a tussle about who is the intended audience for these journals. And the church historian is saying these are meant only for the descendants of the handcart pioneers to read. They're not for you to write about, you Gentile in the New Jerusalem. He's known to be very thorough in his research and in his writing, and he actually does a day-by-day journal of the handcart trek. He compiles everything every single day of that trek from 1856 to 1860, and those are the kinds of things that you can see when you go into an archive. So I have one other Stanford Library correspondent with the Utah Authority, and those of you who are here earning one credit of legal continuing education can pay attention now, because I did find that he and his friend, Joe Quinney, who is the namesake for the building in which we sit today, are corresponding, because Stegner is again drawing on his Salt Lake City friends to attain material for the story Joe Hill about the martyred labor activist who was executed at the Utah State, the Sugar House prison in 1915. So counselors, those of you who want to see this letter, I have a copy of it, and you can see a copy of it, and it really details this beautiful friendship between the Quinneys and the Stegners, talking about the time in which Stegner is visiting in numerous occasions to the Quinney home at Bear Lake. Quote, "At Bear Lake and during the summer months, my recollections are always freshened as I wind my way down the Wally Trail through the rocks to the water's edge. Best regards to you and Mary, from Joe." Joe, of course, was also the father of Utah skiing. So I can't say for sure if Joe Quinney always wrote so prosaically, but I think he was motivated in talking to Stegner, stepped it up a little bit when he's writing to him. He would return to the university on several occasions. Here he's receiving the Doctor of Humane Letters in 1968. And in this picture at Sam Weller Zion's bookstore, Wallace Stegner in the middle, he's with the head of special collections, Ev Cooley, and the head of the J. Willard Merritt Library, Roger Hansen. And I found a letter in which he describes these occasions in which he comes back to the University of Utah to speak to the Friends of the Marriott Library, and particularly doing it as a favor for his friends Parm and David Freed, his old friend from the tennis team. Stegner tells Irvine about trying to find the old I&M store in his last 2 visits to Salt Lake. Quote, "The last couple of times I haven't dared call. I guess I don't want not to recognize you. I don't want you not to recognize me. We ain't the same, and it's been too long since we saw each other. I might burst into tears. Anyway, that's the only explanation I've got. Maybe next time we ought to take ourselves in hand and face the music. I will grin at you with toothless face, looking like a sea urchin, and you could put your hand behind your ear and say, 'Hey, what's that?' I got a letter from Jim Gilbert the other day, the only one in 40 years, more or less. Maybe it's time for a reunion. Here come the Tillicums, I hope. Wally." In this picture, this is above Los Altos Hills, where Stegner was honored by the establishment of the Stegner Bench. I went on a pilgrimage on this hike last year. It honors him for his contributions to the creation of the open space preserved there, the Long Ridge open space. And at this time, he writes, this is the last letter chronologically in the collection, and he writes to Annie Irvine, who is the widow of Jack Irvine, on December 22nd, 1987. Quote, "This will be a great Christmas for you. I hope not too gray. Healing takes a while. We learn pretty slowly to accept what we have to accept and do without what we want never to give up. But we do seem to be assembled so that we survive and even get to enjoying life again. And I'm sure you will. One problem about living with one of the greatest people is that he leaves a bigger hole than most people would. I'm glad you liked the last book. I had Jack in mind a lot as I wrote it, for he was the first real friend I had, and the longest and the best. The places and people in the novel are deliberately different, but the feeling is what I learned from him. Good luck and good health in 1988. Best, Wally." So Stegner, while he was here, got drunk, chased girls, fell in love for the first time, was rudely jilted for the first time, all in Salt Lake City. He also wrote his first story and he finished his first novel here, and a number of essays that contributed to those stories. Quote, "I have always envied people with a hometown. That's why I've been astonished on a couple of recent trips through Salt Lake City to find a conviction growing in me that I am not as homeless as I had thought. At worst, I had thought myself an Ishmael. At best, a half stranger in the city where I had lived the longest, a Gentile in New Jerusalem. But a dozen years of absence from Zion, broken only by 2 or 3 short revisitings, have taught me different. I am as rich in a hometown as anyone." In The Sound of Mountain Water. Quote, "I think you don't choose between the past and the present. You try to find the connections." And that's what I have tried to do as a university historian and as someone who grew up here, is making those connections between education and the lives that we go on to live and the purpose that we find in those careers. When he gave me these letters, Robert Irvine said, "I want you to know that my father kept these letters, now nearly 100 years old, throughout his life, and only gave them to me with other mementos of his youth shortly before he died. I give them to you because of your interest in history, but I would hope they eventually find their way to the University of Utah archives or someplace suitable." His clever letters had heartfelt closings such as this one, "Love and frenzied embraces." It helps us understand why Utah was never far from his mind, how he went from being a displaced to a placed person here. And I hope that this gift of letters is going to help others to understand their place here, because we all feel lonely. We all feel othered at times in our careers, and I promise you, if you do go into the special collections, you are bound to find, because we have one of the best literary collections anywhere here at this university. Readers of his full body of work know that the men that he would go on to honor include Bernard DeVoto and John Wesley Powell. And now through this gift of collected letters, they included Garner Irvine, a Salt Lake antique dealer and tennis companion. I want to just briefly thank my Stanford colleagues who are with me today online. I want to thank the staff of the Marriott Library Special Collections, the Tanner Humanities Center, and the Wallace Stegner Center for Land Resources and the Environment at the S.J. Quinney School of Law. I want to also thank the Alta Club laureates who are with us and who helped me and my family and also especially my digital designer, Ella Irvine Peterson, and law student Shauna Smith for her production assistance. So thank you very much, and we will see if there's any time for questions.
So I have if you want to ask a question in the room, I should have announced this ahead of time, but if you go to slido.com, that's SLIDO.com, and you do, maybe it's even being pulled up here. There it is.
There it is.
You enter the code, the hashtag Stegner. You can ask a question. I have a few here on the Slido already, but before, if I can just add a couple of thanks, I should have done this before as well. I'd like to thank the Tanner Humanities Center for co-sponsoring the event, and the Cultural Vision Fund, which provides support to the Stegner Center's programs, including lecture today. At any rate, here is a few of these, and if we have questions in the room, feel free to raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you. But here's one to start. I noticed that the photos of the Stegner letters that he signed his name spelled Stegner, Steckner, instead of Stegner. Why do we spell it Stegner?
The correct spelling of his name is Stegner with a G, but they all had funny little nicknames for one another, so he's making a joke about one of the nicknames his friends had for him, Stegner.
Great. Here's another one. What are the most important local landmarks that help us understand the young Wallace Stegner?
Well, the book, you can definitely find those with the help of the book Wallace Stegner, Salt Lake City, that I mentioned, by the University of Utah Press. And, people who are historical like to go to graveyards and cemeteries, and you can see the marked and the unmarked graves of his parents. His father killed his lover and then himself, and it was a disgraceful time for the Stegner family. So his father's gravestone actually is unmarked, but it's next to his mother and his brother Cecil, who died of pneumonia. The I&M store is no longer there. He talks about in these letters going up to Pinecrest and Pine View both. So they're experiences in the Seven Canyons, he had them with his college friends and girlfriends. Mentions going skiing at Brighton. So many of these places one can visit today.
This one's a little bit more personal to you, but I'd love to hear the answer to this. Would you be willing to discuss your own history, which in many ways matches up with Stegner's history, time in Utah and California particularly, and whether it's created you a desire to preserve and celebrate the American West?
Well, thank you for whomever submitted that kind question. Yes, I did grow up in my great-grandparents' house in Salt Lake City, and I went to UC Berkeley for my undergraduate. Really was interested, I suppose, in the life of the mine myself, and have been very fortunate. My first part of my career, I was a journalist with the Salt Lake Tribune, and then I worked at the University of Utah in a number of different communication and program management capacities. And in 2016, I was invited to join the Graduate School of Education at Stanford to run the Aspen Presidential Fellowship for Community College Leadership. And that's given me a chance to really think about building of great colleges and great college leaders. And I found that very rewarding. I also enjoy doing oral histories and have done some oral histories for the David Eccles School of Business, the Everett Cooley Collection, and the Marriott Library, especially histories of academic leaders of both Stanford and the University of Utah. Often we're so busy developing the expertise of students and future professors that the stories of academics aren't collected, and I think that's a real shortcoming of institutions, so I try to do what I can to contribute.
All right, I have one more, but I would give the privilege to anyone in the audience here that's live that if there's someone that has a burning question. Okay. I saw flinch here. I'm coming back to you, perhaps.
There's a new book about Bernard DeVoto and Avis.
Yes.
And is there a lot of Stegner material in that book? And have you read it?
Yes, and Nate Schweber, the question was about the new biography of Bernard DeVoto, which is written by Nate Schweber. And Nate was hoping to be with us today, but he's on assignment in Boise. He actually sent me a picture of a golden trout that he caught yesterday. It's very interesting that this young writer from Brooklyn also did what Stegner did, which was to write a biography of Bernard DeVoto, great conservationist and environmentalist as well. So I can't quite come up with the title of the book, but with those keywords and the author's name, I can recommend the book as well. I know some of our laureates have also read that too. Thank you.
So just maybe one more. Stegner's early history you discussed shows how he became interested and, in fact, accomplished in writing. What are the events that we can look to that caused him to want to be a powerful voice for Western landscapes?
Well, again, I think in terms of Western landscape, it was this idea of he was a powerful observer of the land, and then when he came here, he felt connected to it. When you think about him going over to Red Butte Creek and digging up the clay and running home and building something with it with his hands to show his East High classmates, he is really very aware of the Mormon, again, the handcart pioneers and the experiences of coming to such a dry and arid land. And so in his career, he both advocates for the preservation of open land, of public land, and writes, of course, the Wilderness Letter.
All right. Well, we're out of time, but let's thank Anne one more time for such a lively and engaging discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been a real honor.
Thank you all for coming. We appreciate you.